What's up, guys? I'm here with Rick Cannavaro from William Ravis Mortgage, and we're going to be talking about the Time to Own program. Rick, this just came out again, and we need some explanation. So tell us what the Time to Own program really is.
Great. It's a great first-time homebuyer program that was rolled out back in the summertime from Governor Lamont. And what's happened is this gives first-time buyers the ability to go into a house with basically zero money down, have their closing costs, all that covered through using these time-to-own proceeds. And in short, what it is it's a grant from the state of Connecticut that can be given either in a $25,000 amount, $50,000 amount, depending on the town that the property is located in, and if it's in a high-cost area versus a low-cost area. So a lot of different requirements that go with the program, but the primary thing is the buyer needs to be a first-time home buyer, which means you haven't owned anything in the last 3 years. In addition to that, they have to be a state of Connecticut resident for the last 3 years. So that's important.
So even if I still have my FHA use, but I own or have owned within the past 3 years, I can no longer get that time to own program.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
So let's say that I have never owned a property and I'm saying, I want to see if I could take advantage of this program. What would my first step be? Obviously contacting you and saying, hey, I'm interested in this program, but what does it look like after that?
Right. So once the pre-approval is done to say, here's what the price range is that the buyer can qualify for, and yes, you are eligible for the time to own program, then the next step is you as the agent would start showing them properties. And what I've discovered with this program is it is very property specific in that when a buyer is looking at a property, let's say for example, I qualify them for $250,000 for a price range. That property in the town of Newington is going to have X amount for taxes. And if you look at the same property over in Rocky Hill, the taxes are obviously going to be different. That changes the buyer's housing debt ratio. And it's a very fickle qualification piece that has to check out accordingly for time to own to work. So in short, if the price range is $250,000 for a buyer in Newington, but they're looking at the same property in Rocky Hill where the taxes are a little bit higher, then their price range, the amount of the time to own could be different for their qualifications.
So if you could bullet point a couple of the qualifications, maybe from the buyer's perspective, what are some things that the buyer has to meet or qualify for to get into this time to own program?
So the biggest thing is the housing debt ratio. So that is 30%, minimum 30% in order to qualify for time to own. What that housing ratio is comprised of is the borrower's income per month divided by whatever the monthly mortgage payment is. That comes up to a percentage, and it has to be a minimum of 30%. If it's below 30%, they would not qualify for the time to own.
Because in theory, they should be so comfortable that they almost maybe financially don't need the help, or they're looking for people that have that higher debt to income ratio where that assistance might be more needed.
Exactly, and the key there is needed. So it is a quote unquote needs-based program.
Gotcha.
So if someone has less than a 30% housing debt ratio, they're not necessarily as needing us versus someone who has over 30% housing debt ratio.
Now from an agent perspective, me being an agent and maybe other agents watching this video, do you have to fill out an offer or a purchase and sale agreement differently given that there are proceeds coming from this, or would a contract still read the same?
So the contract will generally still read the same because in short, what this is for a buyer, it's 100% financing. So the buyer's going to get a first and second mortgage, both CHAFA loans. So the CHAFA first mortgage is going to be the majority of the loan. And then the second mortgage would be the time to own, which is forgivable. Let's make sure that's understood too. Is the beauty of this program is after 10 years, that entire time to own amount, whether it's for $25,000 or $50,000, is completely forgiven.
So if you own that property for 10 years, your loan that you get is forgiven. Now, let's say that I sold my house after the 8th year.
Yeah.
Does it become a percentage of what I would owe based off of the time that I was there? What does that look like?
Yeah, very good question. So the way it works is every year that the buyer remains in the house as their primary residence, 10% of that loan is forgiven. So for someone who's resided there for 8 years, 80% of their loan amount would be completely forgiven. And if they sold at the end of year 8, then the remaining 20% that's left over would get paid off with the proceeds from the sale of the house.
Gotcha. So in theory, if you got the $50,000 loan and you moved out year 8, you would owe a $10,000 on the back end at closing.
Correct.
Okay.
Yep.
Now,
actually, well, 20,000 you would owe. I'm sorry, you're right. 10,000.
10,000. Yeah. Yep. Yeah.
Just making sure you're.
We run a lot of numbers. Give us a break.
Absolutely.
Now, are there any other perks that we should be aware of? Obviously, this is huge because it allows people to get in with essentially no money or minimal money down.
Correct.
Are there still some costs that are associated with a purchase when you're doing the time to own, or does it cover everything down to appraisal costs and things like that?
Very good. So yes and no. It covers the majority of what a buyer will need. But if a buyer is going to go through a home inspection, which generally is a good idea to have done, especially for first-time home buyers, that is not covered.
Okay.
That's an out-of-pocket cost that the buyer still has to budget for separately. In addition, generally when you make the offer, you're still going to do a upfront earnest money deposit that the buyer has to have liquid to do that. That money ultimately would come back to them at closing because they'll have the 100% financing proceeds, but it's an upfront cost the buyer still has to budget for.
Okay.
So those are a couple things. And I think going back to the contract question, when you're structuring the contract, in short, it is 100% financing, but for the program type, you'd want to check off CHAFA and time to own because the time to own is the second mortgage component.
Understood. Okay. Now, not to jump back to some of the requirement stuff, but when it comes to the buyer, are there certain parameters of credit score or things of that nature that the program looks for, or does it follow the usual CHAFA standards or what just the lender has set as like a guideline? So
with regards to credit scores, yes, there are some thresholds there. So if a buyer is doing a CHAFA conventional loan, the minimum credit score is 620. Okay. So they have to be at least a 620 or higher to do a CHAFA conventional loan. Now, there's also CHAFA FHA, where there's a little bit more flexibility. And with a CHAFA FHA, the minimum score goes down to a 600, and that gives them the ability to still utilize the time to own funds for the second mortgage.
Excellent. And I know you said that it's a very property by property basis based off of things like the changing taxes. Are there certain pockets of towns or neighborhoods that are essentially blocked to say this would definitely be a time to own program area, or is it just coming down to the numbers when you crunch them on the buyer's perspective of what their debt to income ratio is for the most part?
So that time to own, it's eligible for the entire state of Connecticut. Where you're going to find the differences in terms of if it's eligible for $25,000 or $50,000 for the buyer, is going to be tied to a high cost town versus a low cost town. So for example, in our area, Glastonbury, which tends to be a higher cost area, that's mostly going to be a $50,000 eligible territory.
So that's what would make the difference between someone getting 25 or 50 is just the area and what's deemed as you might need more money based off of the cost to get into the area, essentially.
Exactly.
Okay. Now, one last thing I want to get into. This program has already happened previously, right?
Yes.
And they had $20 million?
$20 million.
And how long did that $20 million last?
That lasted for about five months. Okay. So it did not last very long.
And this time there's what, 11 million or 12?
So this time around 13 million has been allocated. Million. So I think the key to understand for buyers that are out there that may be eligible for this is to grab hold of this sooner rather than later, because since they've only approved 13 million this time around, my guess is this might only be 3 to 4 months that it's available, depending on how much additional loans come through.
And just one last bonus question.
Yeah.
If I am a buyer, can I know if I would get approved for this program before I'm under contract, if I can give a specific property? or do I have to be under contract to essentially get the final approval or not?
Very good. So that's actually a great question. So when a buyer gets pre-approved, what I've been explaining to buyers up front is the availability of those funds. It can change like that. So if we pre-approve them today, and let's say a month, 2 months goes by before they find the right property, the buyer just needs to understand that if those funds are no longer have all been used up, then we'd have to shift to a plan B, which would be, for example, down payment assistance.
Right.
So another variant that a buyer could use, but it doesn't have the same benefits as the time to own.
Awesome.
Yep.
So if you want more information on this program, Rick is your guy. Give him a call, and hopefully I'll be happy to help you purchase that property as well. So
one last thing too, if you wouldn't mind, just to comment.
Yeah, please.
The timeline. It's a good 60-day timeline from start to finish.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. So it does prolong the usual closing time by maybe a couple of weeks on average.
Yes, and the biggest thing to understand for both you as the agent as well as the buyer and even the seller is from the time the loan is approved by us as a lender, we have to send it to CHAFA to get their final blessing. CHAFA right now is averaging 30 days just to look at the loan.
Wow.
So.
Okay.
You know, when you're setting guidelines and the timeline on the contract, that 60-day requirement is pretty much like a base. It could even be a little bit longer than that, depending on how quickly things come together.
And you know what? The questions are still coming to my head, so I have to ask this.
Yeah.
Is there certain guidelines that a property needs to meet, like with FHA or CHAFA? There are sometimes peeling paint, missing hand railings, things like that could come up.
Yeah.
Does it follow one of those guidelines, or does it have its own guidelines?
So it'll follow the overall agency guidelines, so Fannie Mae or FHA.
Based off of which overall financing you're going. Okay.
Yeah. So if a buyer is going with a CHAFA conventional loan, as long as the overall property condition is good, then we can proceed with that. Meaning that the property is not in disrepair, a buyer could close and move into the property. Versus if someone's going with a CHAFA FHA program and still using the time to own, the property will have to meet FHA criteria. So peeling paint will come up. Roofs sometimes can become an issue if it's at the end of its life. Hand railings, any type of safety related issues that the house might present will come up in a FHA appraisal inspection. And if it does, it will need to get addressed before closing.
All right. Anything else that you can add?
I think just the biggest thing to understand for buyers, real estate agents, and sellers, it's great, absolute, really solid program. A lot of very popular in this case, but the timeline. I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind is just patience, because it is, like I said, a very solid 60-day process. And essentially it's 60 days, from contract acceptance to the date that you close, with the understanding if an extension is needed, there's a reason why, because it's a very popular program, and CHAFA is just backlogged.
Got it. So it's like traffic going in. There's only so many people that can get it in.
It's a small state agency, that the entire state of Connecticut funnels into, and the staffing is what it is. And that's I think patience is the biggest component of that program.
Gotcha.
Yep.
Well, thank you very much for all the information.
Thank you for having me. Love to talk about it, and thank you guys.
All right. Talk to you guys soon.